Hi everybody, and welcome to a new video in the video series on systems biology, digital twins, and AI. We are still in block 4, and now we have gone through all of the machine learning and pure AI models. So we have those at our disposal. So those are the black box models here. And since already block 1, we have learned how to formulate reaction-based models and blood flow type of models and electrical models and so on. We learned how to train them to data and so on as individual models. So now the question is, how do we combine these different type of models into an interconnected larger models that has all of these different models as submodels? That's what we're going to talk about in this video. So the first is to identify a module. What is a module, and how can we use those to create hierarchical models that consist of modules, and how can we sort of do that in a flat way where all of the equations are in one big file, or in an object-oriented way where we have many different files that each correspond to one module. And then once we introduce that, it will be very natural to talk about hybrid models, because then the different modules are made up of different model formalisms. And we'll look a little bit about how we can combine different model formalisms with each other, parallel, sequential, and blended models. And then in the end, some examples, or we'll take some examples first on the modular and hierarchical, and then some examples on the hybrid models. Okay, so that's what we are going to do. So, a module. A module is something that takes some kind of inputs and some kind of and calculates that using some kind of internal representation that is specific to the submodel, and some kind of formalism, and uses that to calculate the output. That's basically what it's doing. So a module is a module if it can simulate and calculate the output given only the input. So it doesn't need what is inside the other modules. And if it needs it, then it has to be included in the inputs to the module. So in that way, sort of everything that the module needs to be able to simulate itself forward to calculate the outputs has to be contained within the module. So if you can identify such a part of the model where you can specify some specific inputs, and if you have those, you can calculate the output, then you have a module. So this input here can either be something that you do to the system, like you give the patient a drug or some insulin or something else, you raise the temperature or whatever it is you do. That's a sort of a user-defined source, user-defined input, which we typically call a U. But it can also be the output of another submodel. And this is what I talked about before. And then the output here, previously when we talked about outputs, it's typically corresponded to measurement data or something that we would like to measure. But here it can also be something that another submodel is needing. So another module might be needing something from this module here, and then that is an output from this module, this submodel, which goes into another module. So that's sort of a little. That's the basic building block, you could say, of these bigger models. And if we have a particular type of model called the hierarchical model, which is a specific type of multi-level model, then we have modules that have a certain type of structure where they form a tree structure. So we have some kind of top level, which might be the whole body level, for instance. And then we have different modules that all get their sort of input from the top level, and that sort of send things back also to the top level. And here, these might be the different organs. So one module might be the heart, one might be the liver, one might be the brain, and so on. And then within each such organ model, we might have submodels, which might correspond to different cells that make up the organ, or things that happens inside the cell. So this might be the sort of cell level, or even the intracellular level. So you see, you have this sort of different levels of biological organization, which is why you call this a multi-level model, or a hierarchical model. And it's a hierarchical model if it sort of has this particular tree structure. So if you have other type of communication, so if this module 1.3 here is also sending input to model 2, for instance, then it's not really a hierarchical model. It's still a multi-level model, sort of. Okay. And here I want to give a little note, which is on the usage of the word hierarchical model and multi-level model. So when you talk about statistical models, then you use this word in a slightly different way. There you have statistical dependencies that determines the output that you want to calculate, the sort of outcome, that corresponds to different levels. And we have encountered one such hierarchical or one such multi-level model already. And those are the nonlinear mixed effects models, the one from block 3. There we have parameters that come from two different levels. We have one from the population level, the population parameters, and then we have the random effects that modify that population parameter with patient-specific or person-specific modification to that. So you sort of have one parameter on the population level, and then which determines sort of things that has to do with what the individual is doing, but you don't know the full details of what the individual is doing until you also have the individual specific parameter, the random effect. So that's also called a hierarchical model, but it's in a slightly different context, because there you sort of talk about a parameter which has a population part and the patient-specific part. Here it's more that you have some kind of subdivision of a big model into different modules that have this hierarchical structure, that they correspond to different levels. But since they are both used commonly, I still want to sort of, even though it increases the confusion a little bit, I still want to say that these are two common usages of the word hierarchical models or multi-level models. They're often used interchangeably, even though they are not strictly speaking interchangeable. Okay, so now we know what the multi-level and a hierarchical model is. And now let's look at how to formulate these in practice in the software. And then you can do that either in a flat way or one that actually makes use of the modules and that formulates them in a modular way also when you implement it. So if you have the flat model, then you have all of your differential equations for both the different compartments, for the plasma and for the liver and for the adipose and the heart and so on. They are all part of one big model. So it's typically a very long file then if you have a big model. And here you have all of the parameters and all of the measurements, and the measurements are typically the only outputs. So that's called a flat model. And then if you want to not have a super long file, but you want to formulate each submodel that describes, so a submodel is a model for a module. Then you take each module and you describe each submodel in a separate file. So you have one top-level model, which only has the top-level differential equations. And here you specify which are the compartments, which are the other modules. And then you have a blood compartment. And here you have the differential equations for the blood compartment. And you have one for the liver compartment, and for the brain, and for the adipose, and so on. And here, note that when you formulate the model here, you just write glucose. And then it's sort of implied that this is the glucose in the blood. And here is the glucose in the liver, because you are in the liver compartment or the blood compartment. So whereas here, when you have everything in a big file, when you write it in a flat model, then you need to have a separate variable name, glucose underscore plasma, for the glucose that is in the plasma, or glucose underscore liver for the glucose that's in the liver, and so on. So that's sort of taken care of by the software. And usually these type of softwares also have automatic ways to deal with volume differences and so on. Okay, so now we sort of know how to formulate multi-level models. Let's take an example. And let's continue with what we sort of started already, which is the metabolic side of the digital twin. So here we have different modules which would correspond to the different organs. And you have some kind of inputs and some kind of outputs. And in order for if you have different submodels for the same module, then a given set of inputs needs to sort of give an output which is in an acceptable range. And that's sort of part of the definition of a modular hierarchical model in this way. So here, to make it a little bit more clear, the input to for instance, the fat tissue would be here, for instance, the glucose and the insulin that goes into the tissue, that one that comes with the blood going into the tissue, so the arterial blood. And the output here could either be the blood that leaves the tissue, the venous blood, or the difference between the arterial and the venous blood, because that's basically what the organ is doing. It's either taking up glucose, or it's taking up insulin, or it's secreting glucose or insulin. So here, the output would be the glucose uptake, but it could also be the glucose in the that leaves the tissue. And these type of data can actually be measured. There are a few groups in the world that can do that, and that's called arteriovenous difference data, where you sample blood going into the tissue and you sample blood going out of the tissue. But in many cases, you're also perfectly happy to work with simulated data, because you want to sort of simulate the model in a modular way. And then many things are the same. So the important thing is that you sort of know the input, you know the output, either by measurement or by simulations. And if you have that, then each model and simulation problem becomes an isolated problem, which you can deal with independently. So you can develop a model for the adipose tissue, or for the muscle, or for the heart, and for the brain, and so on, as a separate modeling problem. You can forget about the rest of the body, and it will work together with the other organ models as long as it fulfills this input-output relation. So it is really simplifies the model development, but also the simulation, because you can do many things such as co-simulation, where you simulate things on different timescales. If you have a very fast module, you can simulate that in a fast dynamics, and then you have some slow things going on as the input is changing to that submodel. And then you simulate that in its own dynamic, and then they are talking to each other in a way that allows you to sort of soundly develop these two timescales simultaneously. So if you do it like this, then you can have different submodel, different versions of the submodel for each module. So here we have two versions of the fat tissue that both take insulin and glucose as input and that calculate the glucose uptake. And they do that, so do you see it here, version 8.1, it has more states, it's more detailed, it has more information in it than version 8.2. And then version 8.3 might be either simpler or even more complicated, and so on. And as long as they fulfill the same input-output profile, they would be fine. You can use them basically interchangeable. So it depends on what type of simulation you want to do. If you want to do a very fast simulation that doesn't care about all of the details in the complex model, then you take a simpler model and so on. So you can basically assemble a big multi-level model that comprises of a collection of sub-models in the different modules that correspond to the need that you have at the particular situation. So if we look here now at the flat model structure of this particular example, where we have everything in just one big file to make it a little bit easier, then you will have the ODEs for the top level model, which describes basically what happens in the blood and on the whole body level. And then you would have in the same file, in the same place here in the description of the model, just a little bit lower down, you would have the ODEs for the cell level model. And here you might have done a new development, and this might be an existing model. So in this top level model, you describe glucose in the plasma, and in this particular model, you only have one term for all of the insulin-dependent glucose uptake. So here you don't separate, in the original model, you don't separate between the insulin-dependent glucose uptake from the muscle or from the fat or from the liver. They are all just one big term. So this is a sort of top-level model here that doesn't divide it into modules. And here we have intracellular things that only belong to one of the cell types. So here the fat tissue, for instance. So in this one, there we can simulate this thing, how insulin, which is the input, leads to changes inside the cell, and in particular, it recruits the glucotransporter 4 to the membrane, so it becomes GLUT4M. So this one would change over time when you add insulin, the input. Whereas the other transporter, GLUT1, that has a time derivative of 0, so that would not change. But you can calculate both of those. And then let's see how we combine these two things, these two levels. This is what describes inside the cell. This is typically trained on data where you're taking out the cells from the body. And the first thing is that you divide this UID term here, the insulin-dependent glucose uptake, into its different organ contributions. So we have one contribution from the muscle and one from the fat and so on. And then for the one that comes from the fat, which is the one that we have here, then we need to make use of these things that we have here, the two transporters of glucose. So that we have the GLUT4 dependent and we have the GLUT1 dependent. And these both come from the adipose tissue, which is the insulin dependent part. So in this particular constant, they would both correspond to a part of the insulin responding fat tissue. So the UID fat, which is this term here. And then you have corresponding expressions for the UID muscle and UID liver and so on. So that's how you combine different models on different levels. And I said before that this model here is typically trained on data from the cell. So then its data for glucose uptake is based on you studying the cells in a test tube, where the glucose uptake is, of course, much smaller because it's in a test tube. And it might also be different because the cells in a test tube might respond a little bit differently compared to what they do when they are still in the body. And that's why you need to have a scaling parameter here. And here we figured out by using this arteriovenous difference data that it's enough to have a linear scaling from the in vitro data to the in vivo human data here. It's just a scaling. Yeah, so this is basically how you combine the different levels with each other. And if you want, you can, of course, and we have done this as well, you can, of course, describe this in a modular way, where you have each organ model in its own file. So then it's no longer a flat model structure, but a modular or object-oriented way of describing. Okay, so that's basically how you subdivide a big model into modules. And if they are all described by, for instance, ordinary differential equation or differential algebraic equations, DAEs, then you can have them in a big file if you want to. But if you don't have that, all of the models are in the same modeling framework. They are not all ODEs or all DAEs, but some of them might be machine learning models. Some of them might be simulated in a software that can simulate biomechanical movement or brain activity type of simulation. So you might have different softwares that simulate different parts of the big model. Then how do you do? Then you need to work with hybrid models. And then the different modules are simulated by different softwares in different ways. And that's called the hybrid model. And I will go through some of the basics of how to formulate also hybrid models. So the simplest is, of course, that you have two different models that are just run in parallel. And another is that you have one model that is simulated first, and that serves as an input to model 2. And the last is that you can't really separate them in this way. They are blended together. And here the sort of modular idea is much more difficult to sort of exploit fully. Here you need to somehow describe them together. So if we take our multi-organ digital twin model, here it could be, for instance, that one is a biomechanical model that simulates the movements in a particular session. And it simulates the forces and the torques and the biomechanical properties of the movement. That might be model 1. And then with the same input, which is what you have exercised, what type of movements you do, and how intense they are, and so on, you might be able to calculate in model 2 the blood flow. And the blood flow generates the blood flow as output, and this generates the forces and the positions of the different body parts and so on as its outputs. And they don't need to talk to each other at all to calculate their own respective things. So they can be run independently of each other altogether. So in this particular case, it's fairly easy to combine them into a big model because it's the same as just having the same input, so to say, to the different models, and then you put the things together in the end. So that's a surprisingly common thing, especially when the models aren't fully integrated, because you don't know exactly how to integrate them in a sort of mechanistic way. Sequential models are also relatively straightforward, especially if you don't have this back arrow here, because then you can basically simulate this model from start to finish, and then you take this as input to this model, and there is no feedback, so you can finish this one, and then this is the master and this is the slave model, you say then you simply take this model first, and then you calculate this one later. You can simulate this one day 1 and this one day 2. If you have this feedback here, then you need to simulate them together. So you take sort of one step here, then you take one step here, and then you update this, which is the input here, and you take a new step here, and so on. So I will give you a combination of a mechanistic multi-level model and a machine learning model in the next couple of slides. But I just want to very, very shortly here say that another example, it's inside the brain. Then this M1 model here would be a neuronal networks that calculates the electrical activity in the brain using these Hodgkin-Huxley models for each neuron that are connected together into a big neuronal network. So that would be model 1. And model 2 then would be the neurovascular coupling that takes the electrical activity simulated by model 1 as input and calculates the changes to the blood flow. So that would be model 2. And that's another part of the digital twin, so to say. So you see that this is also very common, and this is, you can simulate this in one software. This is simulated in packaged neuron, and then this one goes over to MATLAB or Python or something here where we simulate the neurovascular coupling model. And for the blended models, then they are fully integrated. And one example here is this, again, nonlinear mixed effect models that you studied in block 3, where you integrate ODE models with statistical models. So the statistical model here is the distribution of the parameters across the population. That's the mixed effect part. Since it's a nonlinear mixed effect model, you combine that with ODEs in a sort of fully integrated model where they are simulated and calculated together in a very integrated way. That's an example of a blended hybrid model. Okay, so I promised to take this example of mechanistic model and machine learning, which you're also going to practice in the computer lab. So let's have a look at this. Here we have the multi-level, multi-timescale mechanistic model, so the M4 model. So here on the longest timescale and the whole body level, we simulate for a high caloric diet, a person who is 40 years and increases his caloric intake by 400 kilocalories per day, then he will gain weight here, or measured in BMI, body mass index, from around 25 to almost 40. So here is really obese. And this is the longest timescale. But for each timescale here, we can take this top level model, take that as input to the organ level models and the meal simulation models. That allows us to calculate a meal response. So here we have not years, but minutes on the x-axis. And we simulate another model that takes this body weight and other things like insulin resistance and so on that's calculated on the whole body level as input to do a short-term simulation. And this is an example of this type of co-simulation. And here we see that in the blue curve, which is the beginning, then we have in the response to a meal, we have a big insulin response. But afterwards, in the 40 years later, the insulin response has basically collapsed. And because of that, we have much higher plasma glucose levels than we have had before. And the glucose uptake by things like the muscle tissue, because we have insulin resistance, is much higher in the beginning than it is after a while, and also because we have lower insulin. So these are the hallmarks of type 2 diabetes. So this is basically showing in a short-term simulation that this person has type 2 diabetes, and this is what the glucose tolerance test or a meal test would give at the end here and at the beginning. And at the same time, we can look into a submodel of one of the organs here, which is what happens inside the fat tissue, and simulate what happens with the insulin receptor substrate 1, the protein kinase B, and with the glucose uptake, this UID_fat. So the glucose uptake in the fat tissue. And you see that they are also changed here. So this is the multi-timescale, multi-level, mechanistic, and multi-organ model. And in the same way, we can simulate another scenario, which is where you eat a little bit less than you usually do, 100 kilocalories less, but you start to exercise also. Then you drop your weight, and you don't see this type 2 diabetes development. You see that the meal response here is basically the same before and after. So this is now model 1. This is a multi-level model, but this is now model 1 in this sequential model. So this goes into a black box machine learning model, namely a regression model, which you learned about in the first video in block 1, that allows us to calculate the absolute risk of a stroke if you know the BMI, the weight of body mass index, you know the blood pressure, which you can simulate, diabetes you saw we can simulate, and so on. So all of these are inputs to the black box model that has as its output the absolute risk of a stroke. And then we can simulate the difference in risk between these two scenarios. So here we have an example of a multi-level, multi-timescale, mechanistic, multi-organ model, which is the model 1. And then the model 2 that you can simulate this first, and then you have those as inputs, which means that you can simulate as a function of time the risk. And you could never do that with the black box model in itself, because this can only take the values as they are now, or these risk factors, and calculate the risk as they are now. So this cannot simulate how things changes over time. So this type of simulation over time of the risk you can only get if you have this hybrid combination of a mechanistic simulation model with a risk calculation model. So this is an example of sort of the power of hybrid models. So now you know how to combine different models with each other in a modular way, in a hierarchical way, and also in a hybrid way. And that's what we will use to assemble the digital twins, which is the topic of the next video.